Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the history of warships. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. Water has always been humanity's greatest highway and most formidable barrier. Long before roads connected distant cities, rivers and coastlines served as the primary routes for trade, exploration, and conquest. The story of warships begins not with grand vessels of oak and iron, but with the simple realization that whoever controlled the water controlled the world. The earliest craft were humble, little more than logs lashed together or animal skins stretched over wooden frames, yet they represented a profound leap in human capability. To venture onto water required not just courage, but an understanding of forces that would later be codified as physics, buoyancy, displacement, and the relationship between an object's weight and the fluid it pushes aside. The first vessels designed specifically for combat emerged along the rivers and coastlines of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, more than 5,000 years ago. These were reed boats and wooden rafts, propelled by oars and primitive sails, carrying warriors armed with spears and bows. The strategic advantage was immediate and obvious. A force that could move along a river could bypass defensive walls, strike at undefended flanks, and retreat before counterattacks materialized. But these early craft were fragile, vulnerable to weather, and easily damaged in any collision. The evolution toward true warships required solving fundamental problems of construction and stability. The ancient Egyptians, masters of the Nile, developed some of the earliest purpose-built military vessels around 3,000 years before the Common Era. Their shipwrights learned to shape wooden planks and join them edge to edge, creating hulls that were both stronger and more watertight than reed construction. These vessels featured a distinctive design: long, narrow hulls that cut efficiently through calm river water, with a single square sail for favourable winds and banks of oars for manoeuvring in battle. The Egyptians understood intuitively what would later be expressed mathematically, that a ship's length-to-beam ratio affected both its speed and stability. A longer, narrower vessel moved faster, but was less stable in rough water, while a wider craft sacrificed speed for seaworthiness. Egyptian war galleys carried archers, who could rain arrows down on enemy vessels or coastal settlements, turning the ship itself into a mobile weapons platform. This concept, the ship as a carrier of projectile weapons, would persist for thousands of years. Yet the Egyptians also experimented with another approach: the ship as weapon. Some vessels featured reinforced prows designed to ram and hole enemy craft. This required understanding the concentration of force, how narrowing the point of impact increased the pressure exerted on the target hull. It also demanded stronger construction throughout the entire vessel, as the shock of ramming could damage the attacker as easily as the defender. Across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians were pushing naval architecture in new directions. As traders and explorers, they needed vessels that could survive open ocean conditions, far from the protected waters of rivers and coastal shallows. Their ships were broader in the beam, with deeper drafts that kept them stable in swells and storms. The Phoenicians developed the birem, a galley with two banks of oars stacked vertically. This innovation doubled the rowing power without significantly lengthening the hull, creating vessels that were both fast and manoeuvrable. The principle was one of mechanical advantage. More oarsmen meant more force applied to the water, propelling the ship forward with greater speed and allowing it to accelerate quickly in battle. The strategic implications were transformative. A faster, more manoeuvrable warship could choose when and where to engage, circling slower opponents and striking at vulnerable points. Naval warfare began to resemble the tactics of land cavalry, with speed and positioning mattering as much as raw fighting power. The Phoenicians guarded their shipbuilding techniques carefully, understanding that their naval superiority was the foundation of their trading empire. Their vessels carried cedar from Lebanon, tin from distant Cornwall, and purple dye that became synonymous with wealth and power. Control of the sea meant control of commerce, and commerce meant wealth enough to build more ships, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of maritime dominance. The Greeks inherited and refined these innovations, pushing the design of war galleys to new levels of sophistication. By the 5th century before the Common Era, the trireme had become the dominant warship of the Mediterranean. With 3 banks of oars and a crew of up to 200 men, these vessels combined speed, agility, and striking power in a package that would dominate naval warfare for centuries. The trireme's bronze-sheathed ram, positioned just below the waterline, could punch through wooden hulls with devastating effect. The key was momentum. The ship's mass multiplied by its velocity determined the force of impact. A skilled crew could accelerate a trireme to ramming speed in seconds, the synchronized stroke of 170 oarsmen driving the vessel forward like a javelin hurled by an invisible hand. But the trireme represented more than just engineering prowess. It embodied a social and economic system. Each vessel required extensive timber, skilled craftsmen, and a trained crew. The oarsmen were not slaves, but free citizens, each one essential to the ship's operation. A trireme could not function with half its crew or untrained rowers. Naval power demanded social cohesion and civic investment. Athens built its empire on a fleet of these vessels, transforming itself from a land power into the Mediterranean's foremost naval force. The victory at Salamis in 480 before the Common Era, where Greek triremes shattered a larger Persian fleet in the narrow straits, demonstrated how naval superiority could determine the fate of civilizations. The Romans, initially a land-focused power, approached naval warfare with characteristic practicality. They studied captured Carthaginian vessels, reverse engineering the designs, and adding their own innovations. Roman warships featured the corvus, a spiked boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy decks, transforming sea battles into the kind of infantry combat where Roman legionaries excelled. This innovation reveals an important truth about military technology. The best solution is not always the most elegant, but the one that plays to your strengths. The Romans could not outrow the Carthaginians, so they changed the nature of naval combat itself. As centuries passed, warship design spread and diversified across the globe. In Asia, Chinese junks developed distinctive batten sails and watertight compartments, innovations that would not appear in Western vessels for more than 1,000 years. Indian Ocean dhows mastered the monsoon winds, their triangular lateen sails allowing them to tack closer to the wind than square-rigged Mediterranean vessels. Each culture's warships reflected its particular needs, resources, and understanding of the sea. The story of naval warfare was becoming a global conversation, conducted not in words, but in the universal language of wood, water, and wind. The collapse of Roman power in the West brought profound changes to naval warfare, though the Eastern Mediterranean remained a crucible of maritime innovation. The Byzantine Empire, heir to Rome's eastern provinces, faced threats from all directions. Arab fleets to the south, Slavic raiders in the Adriatic, and later, Viking longships probing from the north. Survival demanded not just maintaining existing naval technology, but advancing it. The Byzantines achieved this through one of history's most fearsome naval weapons, a substance so terrifying that its formula was guarded as the empire's most precious secret: Greek fire. Greek fire was a liquid incendiary that could burn on water, a nightmare for wooden warships and their crews. The exact composition remains uncertain to this day, lost when the Byzantine Empire finally fell, but historical accounts describe a mixture that likely included petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and naphtha. What made it truly revolutionary was its delivery system. A bronze siphon mounted on the bow of Byzantine dromons, warships that evolved from earlier galley designs. Under pressure, the mixture was forced through the siphon and ignited as it emerged, creating a jet of flame that could reach enemy vessels 30 or 40 feet away. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. Sailors who watched fire spread across water, consuming ships and men alike, often broke and fled before the flames reached them. The dromon itself represented significant advances in naval architecture. These vessels combined the speed of oared galleys with improved seaworthiness for Mediterranean conditions. They featured 2 banks of oars, a single mast with a lateen sail, and raised fighting platforms at bow and stern. The hull design incorporated lessons learned over centuries, a length-to-beam ratio that balanced speed with stability, and construction techniques that created a stronger, more flexible structure. Byzantine shipwrights understood that wood was not uniformly strong in all directions. Planks aligned with the grain could bend without breaking, absorbing the stress of waves and combat. This knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, was as valuable as any written formula. While the Mediterranean remained a battleground of established powers, the northern seas witnessed the rise of a radically different warship tradition. The Vikings emerged from Scandinavia in shallow draft vessels that could navigate rivers as easily as open ocean, a versatility that made them nearly unstoppable raiders. The longship represented a triumph of adaptation to specific environmental conditions. Viking shipwrights worked primarily with oak, shaping long, overlapping planks in a technique called clinker construction. Each plank overlapped the one below it, creating a flexible hull that could twist and bend with the waves, rather than fighting against them. Iron rivets joined the planks, and the gaps were sealed with wool or animal hair soaked in pine tar. The result was a vessel of remarkable capabilities. A longship could cross the North Atlantic, riding out storms that would swamp heavier, more rigid craft, then navigate up shallow rivers to strike deep inland. The draft of a typical longship was only about 3 feet when fully loaded, meaning it could operate in water barely deep enough to float it. This shallow draft, combined with a symmetrical hull design that allowed the ship to reverse direction without turning around, made Viking vessels perfect for hit-and-run warfare. They could beach directly on shore, disgorge their crews for a raid, and depart before defenders could organise a response. The Vikings reached Iceland, Greenland, and North America centuries before Columbus, their longships carrying them farther than any European vessels before them. The strategic impact of Viking raids forced coastal societies to rethink their defences. Monasteries and towns that had felt secure inland, protected by distance from the sea, discovered that rivers were highways for attackers. The Vikings demonstrated that naval power was not just about controlling sea lanes, but about projecting force deep into territories that thought themselves safe. This lesson would echo through military history. Mobility and surprise can overcome superior numbers and fortifications. European kingdoms began building their own fleets, not exact copies of longships, but vessels adapted from Viking principles, merging northern and Mediterranean design traditions. In Asia, naval warfare followed different trajectories shaped by distinct geographic and political contexts. China's rivers and coastal waters saw the development of the junk, a vessel type that would prove remarkably enduring. Chinese shipwrights pioneered several innovations that would eventually spread worldwide. Watertight compartments divided the hull into separate sections so that damage to one area did not necessarily sink the entire vessel. This principle, based on understanding how water flows and equalizes pressure, meant that a junk could survive damage that would doom a Western ship of similar size. The battened sail, with horizontal bamboo strips supporting the cloth, was stronger and more controllable than unsupported sails, and could be quickly reefed or adjusted to changing wind conditions. By the Song dynasty, around 1,000 years after the Common Era, Chinese war junks had grown to impressive sizes, some reportedly carrying crews of several hundred men. These vessels featured multiple decks, castle-like superstructures for archers and crossbowmen, and early forms of gunpowder weapons. The Chinese had discovered gunpowder centuries earlier, and by this period were experimenting with its military applications. Early fire lances, bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder that shot flames and projectiles, appeared on naval vessels. These weapons were crude by later standards, effective at close range, but unreliable and dangerous to their operators. Yet they represented the first steps toward a technology that would eventually revolutionize warfare at sea as thoroughly as it did on land. The Indian Ocean saw yet another naval tradition flourish. Arab and Persian sailors developed the dhow, optimized for monsoon sailing across vast distances. The dhow's triangular lateen sail, angled to the mast, allowed the vessel to sail much closer to the wind than square-rigged ships could manage. This was crucial in the Indian Ocean, where predictable seasonal winds determined trade routes and timing. A dhow could tack back and forth, making progress even when the wind was not directly favourable, a capability that gave merchants and naval forces greater flexibility. The principle at work was aerodynamic lift. The curved sail acted like an airplane wing, generating force perpendicular to the wind direction. This allowed movement at angles that seemed to defy common sense, the vessel actually sailing partially into the wind. These different traditions, Mediterranean galleys, Viking longships, Chinese junks, and Indian Ocean dhows, represented parallel solutions to the fundamental problem of moving people and weapons across water. Each design optimized for specific conditions: the Mediterranean's relatively calm seas and short distances, the North Atlantic's brutal storms and tides, China's rivers and coastal waters, the Indian Ocean's monsoon patterns. There was no single best warship design, only vessels more or less suited to their particular contexts. This diversity would persist for centuries, even as trade and conflict began to spread ideas and technologies across cultural boundaries. The medieval period also saw the emergence of larger, more specialized warships in European waters. The cog, a northern European design, featured a flat bottom and high sides, making it an excellent cargo carrier that could also serve in warfare. These vessels could not match galleys for speed or maneuverability in calm conditions, but they could operate in the rougher waters of the Atlantic and North Sea, where galleys struggled. The raised forecastle and sterncastle provided platforms for archers and crossbowmen, turning the ship into a floating fortress. Naval combat in northern waters increasingly resembled sieges, with crews trying to clear enemy decks with missile fire before closing for boarding actions. The transformation of naval warfare accelerated dramatically in the 14th and 15th centuries, driven by innovations that would reshape not just ship design, but the entire nature of conflict at sea. The introduction of gunpowder weapons to European naval combat marked a turning point as significant as the invention of the sail itself. Cannon, first appearing on ships in the early 1300s, were initially small, unreliable devices that posed nearly as much danger to their own crews as to the enemy. These early guns were made of wrought iron, essentially iron bars hammered together and reinforced with hoops. a construction method that made them prone to catastrophic failure. When a cannon barrel burst, the explosion could kill everyone nearby and set fire to the wooden deck. Yet despite these dangers, the potential of ship-mounted artillery was undeniable. A single cannon shot could hole a wooden hull, dismast a vessel, or sweep an enemy deck clear of men. The challenge was making these weapons reliable and powerful enough to justify their considerable weight and the risk they posed. Metallurgy became crucial to naval power in ways it had never been before. Founding cannon in bronze created stronger, more uniform barrels that could withstand higher pressures, allowing for larger powder charges and heavier projectiles. But bronze was expensive, requiring copper and tin in specific proportions, and the casting process demanded skilled artisans who understood how molten metal cooled and contracted. The weight of cannon created new engineering challenges for ship designers. A single large gun might weigh several tons, and a warship needed multiple weapons to be effective in combat. All this weight had to be positioned low in the hull to maintain stability. Shipwrights began cutting gun ports into the sides of vessels, below the main deck, creating what would become the characteristic profile of the age of sail warship. Multiple decks with rows of cannon protruding from the hull. Each gun port was a hole in the ship's structure, a potential weak point, and an opening through which water could enter if the ship heeled over or took waves across the beam. The Portuguese and Spanish led European naval development during this period, driven by their ambitions to explore and control ocean trade routes. Portuguese carracks and caravels combined square-rigged and lateen sails, creating vessels that could sail efficiently both with favourable winds and when tacking into unfavourable ones. The caravel, relatively small and manoeuvrable, could explore shallow coastal waters and navigate up rivers. The carrack, larger and more heavily armed, could carry substantial cargo while defending itself against pirates and rival powers. The Portuguese discovery of the sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 fundamentally altered global trade patterns and naval strategy. For the first time, European powers could bypass the overland routes controlled by Middle Eastern and Central Asian powers, directly accessing the spices, silk, and other goods that commanded premium prices in Europe. But this required maintaining control of sea lanes thousands of miles from home ports, a challenge that demanded not just capable ships, but entire systems of supply, repair, and reinforcement. The Portuguese established fortified trading posts along the African and Indian coasts, creating a network of bases that allowed their fleets to operate far from Europe. This expansion brought European naval technology into contact and conflict with established Asian naval powers. In the Indian Ocean, Portuguese warships encountered Arab dhows, Indian vessels, and eventually Chinese junks. The Portuguese held significant advantages in artillery. Their ships carried more guns, mounted in organised broadsides that could concentrate fire on a single target. Asian vessels, while often larger and carrying more men, typically relied on boarding tactics and close-range combat. The Portuguese strategy was to stand off at a distance where their cannon could strike, but enemy archers and hand weapons could not reach them, methodically battering opponents into submission. The Spanish, meanwhile, focused on the Atlantic and the newly discovered Americas. Spanish treasure fleets carried enormous quantities of silver and gold from Mexico and Peru back to Europe, wealth that funded Spain's military ambitions but also made these fleets tempting targets. Protecting the treasure fleets required powerful warships. The galleon emerged as the dominant Spanish design. Galleons were longer and narrower than carracks, with a lower forecastle that reduced wind resistance and improved sailing characteristics. They carried heavy armament on multiple decks and could fight effectively while also transporting cargo. Naval warfare in this era was brutal and often decisive. Ships fought at ranges measured in dozens of yards rather than miles, close enough to see individual faces through the smoke and chaos. The sound of battle was overwhelming. The crash of cannon fire, the splintering of wood, the screams of wounded men, and the crackle of flames. Fire was perhaps the most feared outcome of any engagement. A single spark could ignite powder stores, and once fire took hold in a wooden ship, it spread with terrifying speed. The English developed their own distinctive approach to naval power under the Tudor monarchs, particularly Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. English warships featured innovations in gun deck design and artillery tactics. English naval thinkers recognised that sustained firepower mattered more than a single devastating broadside. They developed drill and training systems that allowed crews to reload and fire more rapidly than their opponents. The difference between firing 3 times in an engagement and firing 6 times could determine victory or defeat. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 demonstrated the effectiveness of these English innovations, though weather and Spanish logistics problems played equally important roles. The Armada, more than 100 ships carrying thousands of soldiers intended to invade England, represented the largest naval force assembled to that point in history. The English fleet, smaller but more manoeuvrable and with longer range guns, refused to fight the battle on Spanish terms. They harassed the Armada up the English Channel, never allowing the Spanish to close for boarding, but inflicting steady damage with their artillery. When the Armada anchored off Calais, English fireships forced the Spanish to scatter. The subsequent storm-racked journey around Scotland and Ireland destroyed more than half the Armada, demonstrating that weather remained a factor beyond any admiral's control, capable of destroying fleets more effectively than any enemy action. The 17th century witnessed the formalization of naval warfare into a science, with tactics, organisation, and ship design becoming increasingly standardized across European navies. The ship of the line emerged as the dominant warship type, a designation that referred not to its construction, but to its role in battle. These vessels were powerful enough to stand in the line of battle, the fundamental tactical formation of the era. Fleets arranged themselves in single file, each ship following the one ahead, presenting their broadsides to the enemy while minimizing their vulnerable bow and stern to enemy fire. This line-ahead formation maximized the number of guns that could be brought to bear while protecting individual ships within the collective strength of the fleet. The evolution of the ship of the line reflected increasingly sophisticated understanding of naval architecture and ballistics. By the mid-1600s, the most powerful warships carried 70 to 100 cannon arranged on 2 or 3 gun decks. The largest guns, firing projectiles of 30 or 40 pounds, occupied the lowest deck where their weight contributed to stability. Lighter guns on the upper decks extended the ship's firepower without raising the centre of gravity dangerously high. This arrangement was based on careful calculation of weight distribution and the stresses that combat and weather would impose on the hull. Construction of these vessels demanded enormous resources. A first-rate ship of the line required thousands of mature oak trees, each selected for specific purposes. The naturally curved timbers that formed the ship's ribs came from trees that had grown in particular ways, their grain following the necessary curve to provide maximum strength. Straight timber for planking required different trees, and masts demanded the tallest, straightest specimens, often imported from Baltic forests. The shortage of suitable timber became a strategic concern for naval powers. England established protected forests and imported masts from New England. France carefully managed its oak forests. Control of timber resources was inseparable from naval supremacy. Naval warfare in this period became increasingly formalized, governed by fighting instructions that prescribed how fleets should maneuver and engage. The English fighting instructions, developed over decades and refined through experience, told captains exactly how to maintain formation, when to open fire, and how to respond to specific enemy actions. This standardization allowed fleets to operate as coordinated units rather than collections of individual ships. But it also had limitations. Commanders who followed the instructions rigidly sometimes missed opportunities that a more flexible approach might have exploited. The actual experience of battle in a ship of the line was an assault on every sense. The gun deck, low and cramped even in peacetime, became hell during combat. Smoke from the cannon filled the space, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet. The noise was physically painful, each shot a percussion that struck the body as much as the ears. Splinters, created when cannonballs struck the ship's timbers, were as deadly as the projectiles themselves, flying through the confined space like wooden daggers. Men worked the guns in teams, each person with a specific role, swabbing the barrel to extinguish embers, loading powder and ball, ramming the charge home, running the gun out through the port, aiming through the smoke and chaos, and firing on command. The Dutch, who had built a trading empire extending from the East Indies to the Caribbean, developed their own approach to naval design and tactics. Dutch warships tended to be shallower in draft than English or French equivalents, an adaptation to the shallow waters of the Netherlands coast and its many harbours. This made them less powerful than comparable-sized foreign vessels, carrying fewer guns and lighter armament, but it also made them more manoeuvrable in coastal waters. The Dutch compensated for individual ship weakness through superior seamanship and aggressive tactics. The Anglo-Dutch wars of the mid to late 1600s saw massive fleet battles in the North Sea and English Channel, with dozens of ships of the line on each side pounding each other for hours or even days. These wars also saw the development of new weapons intended to give one side an edge. Fireships, vessels deliberately set ablaze and steered into enemy fleets, became a standard part of naval arsenals. The threat of fireships forced anchored fleets to maintain constant vigilance and complicated blockade operations. Bomb vessels, specialised ships mounting large mortars that could lob explosive shells in high arcs, allowed attackers to strike coastal fortifications and cities from standoff distances. France under Louis XIV invested enormous resources in creating a navy that could challenge English and Dutch maritime supremacy. French shipwrights brought scientific principles to naval architecture, carefully measuring and documenting the dimensions and performance of different designs. They experimented with hull shapes, seeking the optimal balance between speed, seaworthiness, and firepower. French ships were often considered the finest of the era in terms of design and construction, though France's strategic focus on land warfare meant its navy sometimes lacked the resources and attention needed to match English naval strength. Naval combat in this era rarely resulted in ships sinking during battle. The wooden hulls, even when badly damaged, retained enough buoyancy to stay afloat unless fire consumed them or they struck rocks. Instead, battles were won by dismasting opponents, killing or wounding so many crew members that resistance became impossible, or battering an enemy ship until its captain struck his colours in surrender. A captured ship, if it could be repaired and brought into port, became a prize that enriched the capturing crew and strengthened their navy. Prize money, distributed according to rank with the largest shares going to officers, provided powerful financial incentives for aggressive action. The logistics of maintaining fleets at sea for extended periods posed challenges that land warfare did not face. Ships required constant maintenance. Wooden hulls leaked, rigging wore out, and sails tore. Keeping a fleet at sea for months demanded supplies of food, water, spare sails and rope, timber for repairs, gunpowder and shot, and countless other necessities. The problem of scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency during long voyages, killed more sailors than combat did. It would not be until the late 1700s that the British Navy discovered that citrus juice prevented scurvy, a finding that gave Britain a significant advantage in the ability to keep fleets operational far from home ports. The 18th century brought naval warfare to its apex in the age of sail, with massive fleets clashing in battles that involved hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. The ships themselves reached the pinnacle of wooden shipbuilding, with first-rate vessels carrying more than 100 guns arranged on 3 decks and displacing over 2,000 tons. These floating fortresses represented the accumulated knowledge of centuries of maritime experience, every line and curve of their hulls refined through trial and error. The larger ships of the line were enormous investments, each costing as much as a substantial palace and requiring years to build. Losing such a vessel in combat or through shipwreck represented a catastrophic loss of national resources. The British Royal Navy emerged as the dominant naval force during this period, a position it would maintain for more than a century. This supremacy rested on multiple factors beyond just ship design. Britain maintained a large merchant fleet that provided a reserve of trained seamen who could be pressed into naval service during wartime. The practice of impressment, essentially forced conscription of sailors, was brutal and unpopular, but gave Britain access to manpower that other nations struggled to match. British dockyards at Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham could build and repair ships more efficiently than foreign rivals, and British admirals developed aggressive tactical doctrines that emphasised closing with the enemy and fighting to decisive conclusions. The concept of breaking the enemy's line became a defining tactical innovation of the era. Rather than engaging in parallel lines exchanging broadsides, an attacking admiral might drive his ships through gaps in the enemy formation, dividing their fleet and concentrating superior force against isolated sections. This manoeuvre was risky, as ships crossing through the enemy line exposed their vulnerable bow or stern to raking fire from multiple opponents. A raking shot, fired down the length of a ship rather than against its side, could pass through the entire vessel, dismounting guns and killing dozens of men with a single projectile. Yet if executed successfully, breaking the line could transform an orderly battle into chaos that favoured the more aggressive and better trained force. Admiral Lord Nelson brought this aggressive approach to its ultimate expression in the early 1800s. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, Nelson commanded 27 ships of the line against a combined French and Spanish fleet of 33. Rather than forming a parallel line, Nelson divided his fleet into 2 columns that drove directly at the enemy formation, accepting the risk of raking fire during the approach in exchange for the opportunity to shatter the enemy line and create multiple small engagements where British gunnery and seamanship would prevail. Nelson's flagship Victory absorbed tremendous damage during the approach, her sails shredded and rigging cut away, men falling dead and wounded around the deck. But once through the enemy line, Victory and the ships following her created havoc. The battle lasted 5 hours and resulted in the capture or destruction of 22 enemy ships without the loss of a single British vessel, though Nelson himself was killed by a musket shot during the fighting. Trafalgar demonstrated that superior tactics, training, and morale could overcome numerical disadvantage even in an era when technology was relatively uniform across opposing fleets. The victory secured British control of the seas for generations. Yet Trafalgar also marked, in a sense, the culmination of one era and the beginning of the end for sailing warships. Even as Nelson's fleet secured victory, technological changes were emerging that would transform naval warfare more dramatically than anything since the introduction of cannon. The American Revolution and the subsequent War of 1812 demonstrated that naval power was not exclusively the province of established European powers. The United States, with a tiny navy by European standards, built frigates that were faster and more heavily armed than typical vessels of their class. The Constitution President and United States were super frigates, larger than standard frigates but faster than ships of the line. These vessels won several single-ship actions against British opponents, significant psychological victories, even though they did not alter the strategic balance. American success illustrated an important principle. Technological or design advantages could allow a weaker power to challenge a stronger one under favourable circumstances. Privateers, privately owned vessels authorised by governments to attack enemy commerce, played an important role in 18th and early 19th century naval warfare. These ships operated under letters of marque, legal documents that distinguished them from pirates, and focused on capturing merchant vessels rather than fighting warships. A successful privateer could earn enormous profits while simultaneously damaging an enemy's trade and stretching their naval resources thin as warships were diverted to convoy protection. The United States employed hundreds of privateers during the War of 1812, and while individually they were no match for ships of the line, collectively they inflicted significant economic damage on British commerce. The challenges of accurately aiming and firing ship-mounted cannon led to incremental but important improvements in gunnery technology. Early gun sights were crude, often just notches filed into the barrel, and aiming in the rolling, pitching environment of a ship under sail required intuition as much as science. Skilled gunners learned to fire at the top or bottom of the roll when the deck was momentarily level, but this limited their opportunities to seconds in each cycle of the waves. The introduction of flintlock firing mechanisms, replacing the slow match that had been used previously, allowed more precise timing. Improvements in powder quality and uniformity made the trajectory of shots more predictable. Naval gunnery also evolved to include different types of ammunition beyond solid shot. Chain shot, two balls connected by a length of chain, was designed to tear through rigging and sails, dismasting an opponent and rendering them immobile. Grape shot, a cluster of smaller projectiles, was devastating against personnel at close range. Heated shot, cannonballs heated red hot before firing, could set enemy ships ablaze if they lodged in wooden hulls. Each type of ammunition had specific tactical applications, and choosing the right one for the situation required judgment and experience. The early 19th century witnessed the beginning of a technological revolution that would eventually render sailing warships obsolete, though the transition would take decades and proceed unevenly across different navies. Steam power, already transforming land transportation and industry, began to appear on experimental naval vessels. The first steam-powered warships were paddle wheelers, with large wheels mounted on either side of the hull that pushed the vessel through water. These early attempts were problematic. The paddle wheels occupied space that would otherwise carry guns, reducing firepower. They were vulnerable to enemy shot, a few hits potentially destroying a ship's propulsion, and the machinery was unreliable, breaking down frequently and requiring coal in quantities that limited range. Yet despite these limitations, the advantages of steam power were undeniable. A steam-powered vessel could move regardless of wind conditions, proceed directly upwind, and maneuver with a precision impossible for sailing ships. In harbours, rivers, and coastal waters, where wind was often unfavourable or variable, steam power offered transformative capabilities. Early steam warships served primarily as tugs and dispatch vessels, but forward-thinking naval officers recognised that these limited applications were just the beginning. If the technical problems could be solved, steam power would change naval warfare as profoundly as cannon had centuries earlier. The French Navy, seeking ways to challenge British naval supremacy, invested heavily in developing practical steam warships. French engineers developed the Python's gun in the 1820s, a shell-firing cannon that launched hollow explosive projectiles rather than solid shot. This innovation increased the destructive power of naval artillery significantly. A shell that exploded inside a wooden ship could start fires, create massive splinter damage, and punch holes far larger than a solid shot of equivalent caliber. The combination of steam propulsion and shell-firing guns suggested a new type of warship that would not rely on the wind and could deliver devastating firepower. The Crimean War of the 1850s provided the first major test of steam-powered warships in combat. At the Battle of Sinope in 1853, Russian ships armed with shell-firing guns destroyed a Turkish squadron, demonstrating the vulnerability of wooden hulls to explosive shells. The following year, French and British forces used floating batteries protected by iron armour to bombard Russian fortifications at Keenburn. These batteries, essentially armoured rafts pushed into position by steam tugs, proved largely immune to Russian shore batteries. Solid shot bounced off the iron plates, and even shells did relatively little damage. The lesson was clear. Armour could defeat the guns that had dominated naval warfare for 3 centuries. France responded first, launching Gloire in 1859, the world's first ocean-going ironclad warship. Gloire retained a wooden hull but covered it with iron plates more than 4 inches thick. She was fully rigged as a sailing ship, but also mounted a steam engine that could drive her at 13 knots. Britain, unwilling to allow France to gain a naval advantage, responded with Warrior, launched in 1860. Warrior was larger, faster, and more heavily armoured than Gloire, with an iron hull rather than iron over wood. The arms race between armour and guns had begun. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, saw rapid innovation in naval technology driven by the urgent demands of combat. The Confederacy, lacking the industrial capacity to match Union ship production, turned to innovative designs that might compensate for numerical inferiority. The CSS Virginia, built on the hull of the scuttled USS Merrimack, was an ironclad with sloped armour designed to deflect shot and a rambo for attacking wooden warships. Virginia's first action in March 1862 demonstrated the obsolescence of wooden warships against armoured opponents. She sank 2 Union vessels and drove 3 others aground, suffering only minor damage from hundreds of hits. The Union had been developing its own ironclad, a radical design by Swedish engineer John Ericsson. USS Monitor featured a revolving turret mounting 2 11-inch guns, a flat deck barely above the waterline, and heavy armour protecting the turret and a small pilot house. The design was unlike anything seen before, a minimal profile offering minimal target area. When Monitor arrived at Hampton Roads the day after Virginia's rampage, the stage was set for history's first battle between ironclad warships. The 2 vessels pounded each other for hours at close range, neither able to inflict decisive damage. The engagement ended inconclusively, but it demonstrated that armour had fundamentally changed naval combat. The introduction of armour created immediate pressure to develop more powerful guns that could penetrate it. Smoothbore cannon, which had been standard for centuries, were replaced by rifled guns, whose spiralling grooves imparted spin to the projectile, dramatically improving range and accuracy. Muzzle loading gave way to breech loading mechanisms that allowed faster firing and larger shells. Gun size increased rapidly as designers sought to punch through ever thicker armour. Naval rifles grew from 6-inch caliber to 8, 10, 12, and eventually 16 inches and beyond. Each increase required stronger gun construction, more powerful propellant charges, and heavier projectiles. The competition between guns and armour drove rapid innovation in metallurgy and manufacturing. Early iron armour was simply rolled plate, strong but brittle, prone to cracking under impact. Steel began to replace iron as industrial processes improved, offering better strength and toughness. Compound armour, steel face hardened onto an iron backing, provided resistance to penetration while maintaining structural integrity. Later, nickel-steel alloys and special heat treatments produced armour that could withstand impacts that would have shattered earlier materials. Each improvement in armour was met by improvements in armour-piercing projectiles, hardened steel shot designed to punch through rather than shatter against resistant surfaces. By the 1870s, the basic form of the modern warship was emerging. Central citadels of heavy armour protected machinery and magazines, while less critical areas received lighter protection or none at all. Turrets mounting heavy guns replaced the broadside batteries of sailing warships, allowing fewer guns to be worked by smaller crews while still providing all-around fire. Steam engines powerful enough to make sails unnecessary allowed the removal of masts and rigging. The transformation from wooden sailing ship to steel steamship had fundamentally changed what a warship was and how naval combat would be conducted. The final decades of the 19th century saw warship design evolve with bewildering speed as naval powers competed to incorporate the latest technological advances. The pre-dreadnought battleship emerged as the capital ship of major navies, a type that would dominate the seas until the early 1900s. These vessels displaced 10 to 15,000 tons, mounted 4 heavy guns in 2 twin turrets, and carried numerous medium-caliber weapons in casemates along the hull. The theory behind this mixed armament was that the heavy guns would engage enemy battleships at long range, while the medium guns fought cruisers and destroyers. In practice, the system created complications in fire control and wasted weight on weapons of questionable utility. The development of more powerful and reliable engines allowed battleships to achieve speeds of 18 knots or more, fast enough to force action on a reluctant opponent or to decline battle when conditions were unfavourable. Triple expansion steam engines, which use steam at 3 successive pressures to extract maximum energy, provided better fuel efficiency than earlier engines while delivering more power. Coal-fired boilers heated water to produce steam, and stokers laboured in hellish conditions, shoveling coal into furnaces that had to be kept burning around the clock. A battleship at full speed might consume hundreds of tons of coal per day, limiting operational range and requiring frequent coaling stops. Torpedo technology, developed in the 1860s and refined over subsequent decades, introduced a new dimension to naval warfare. The self-propelled torpedo, essentially an underwater missile powered by compressed air and later by more sophisticated engines, could sink the largest battleship if it struck in the right location. Early torpedoes were short-ranged and unreliable, as likely to circle back and strike the launching vessel as to hit the intended target. But by the 1890s, torpedoes could travel several thousand yards at speeds exceeding 20 knots, carrying warheads powerful enough to blow holes in armoured hulls below the waterline. The torpedo boat, small and fast, represented an attempt to use relatively inexpensive vessels to threaten expensive battleships. These craft, displacing only a few hundred tons and armed primarily with torpedoes, could theoretically close with enemy battle lines at night or in poor visibility, launch their weapons, and escape before heavy guns could respond. The threat was sufficiently serious that navies developed countermeasures. The torpedo boat destroyer, soon shortened simply to destroyer, was designed to screen battleships from torpedo boat attacks. Destroyers were larger and more seaworthy than torpedo boats, fast enough to catch them, and armed with quick-firing guns that could riddle their thin hulls. Ironically, destroyers also carried torpedoes, making them effective attackers as well as defenders. The development of quick-firing guns in the 1880s transformed naval combat at medium and close ranges. Earlier naval rifles required minutes to load, aim and fire, with crews working to manhandle heavy shells into the breach. Quick-firing guns used fixed ammunition, with shell and propellant charge combined in a brass case that could be loaded as a single unit. Hydraulic or spring mechanisms absorbed recoil and returned the gun to battery automatically. These innovations allowed sustained fire at rates of 10 or more rounds per minute from medium-caliber weapons. A destroyer or cruiser armed with quick-firing guns could put dozens of shells onto a target in the time an old-style gun fired once. Naval gunnery at longer ranges remained problematic despite improvements in gun technology. At distances of 5,000 yards or more, hitting a moving target from a moving platform required solving complex mathematical problems. The shell's time of flight meant shooting at where the target would be rather than where it was. Range, the target's speed and course, wind, and the ship's own motion all affected where the shell would land. Early fire control relied on individual gun captains estimating the necessary adjustments, leading to wildly inconsistent results. Battles were fought at relatively close ranges where visual sighting worked adequately, but the potential advantages of engaging from beyond the enemy's effective range remained unrealized. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 provided crucial data on how modern warships performed in sustained combat. The war culminated in the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, where the Japanese fleet under Admiral Togo intercepted the Russian Baltic Fleet after its 8-month voyage halfway around the world. The Japanese had advantages in speed, gunnery training, and crew morale, while the Russian fleet was exhausted, poorly maintained, and hampered by outdated tactics. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of concentrated fire from pre-dreadnought battleships at ranges of 5 to 8,000 yards. Of the 38 Russian vessels that entered the battle, only 3 reached the safety of neutral ports. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. The British Royal Navy, observing these developments, undertook a radical redesign of the battleship. HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, represented such a leap forward that she rendered all previous battleships obsolescent overnight. Dreadnought mounted 10 12-inch guns in 5 turrets, eliminating the mixed batteries of earlier designs in favour of a uniform main armament. This all-big gun concept simplified fire control, as all guns fired the same ammunition with the same ballistics, making it easier to observe fall of shot and correct aim. Dreadnought was also the first major warship powered by steam turbines rather than reciprocating engines. Turbines were lighter, more efficient and smoother running, allowing Dreadnought to achieve 21 knots, faster than any contemporary battleship. The launch of Dreadnought sparked a new naval arms race, particularly between Britain and Germany. Both nations laid down multiple Dreadnought-type battleships each year, each new class incorporating improvements over its predecessors. Guns grew from 12-inch to 13.5-inch to 15-inch caliber. Armour thickened to resist these more powerful weapons. Fire control systems became increasingly sophisticated, with rangefinders, mechanical calculators, and direct-to-firing systems that allowed a single officer to control all of a ship's main guns. Speed increased to 25 knots for battlecruisers, a new type that sacrificed armour for speed while retaining battleship-caliber guns. World War I transformed naval warfare through both combat experience and technological innovation driven by desperate necessity. The war began with both Britain and Germany possessing powerful dreadnought fleets, each side hoping for a decisive battle that would secure command of the seas. Yet the expected clash of battle fleets occurred only once, at Jutland in May 1916, and the results were ambiguous. The British Grand Fleet engaged the German High Seas Fleet in the largest battleship action in history, with more than 250 ships participating. The fighting lasted for hours as the fleets manoeuvred at high speed, exchanging fire at ranges that sometimes exceeded 20,000 yards. British battlecruisers, with their thin armour sacrificed for speed, proved disastrously vulnerable when German shells penetrated to their magazines. 3 British battlecruisers exploded and sank within minutes, each taking most of her crew with her. The battle demonstrated that even the most powerful warships remained fragile when faced with weapons designed specifically to destroy them. Armour could be penetrated, magazines could explode, and ships worth millions of pounds could disappear beneath the waves in seconds. The British lost more ships and men than the Germans at Jutland, but the strategic situation remained unchanged. The German fleet returned to port and largely stayed there for the remainder of the war, unwilling to risk another encounter with a grand fleet that maintained overwhelming numerical superiority. Surface actions between capital ships became rare, as neither side was willing to gamble their fleet on a single engagement. Instead, the submarine emerged as the truly revolutionary weapon of the naval war. German U-boats, operating against Allied merchant shipping, came closer to defeating Britain than the high seas fleet ever did. Submarines could patrol shipping lanes, approach merchant vessels on the surface using their diesel engines, and sink targets with torpedoes or deck guns. Early in the war, international law required submarines to surface, warn merchant crews, and allow them to abandon ship before sinking the vessel. But this procedure exposed submarines to ramming or gunfire from armed merchant ships, and Germany eventually abandoned these restrictions. Unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking without warning, sent hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping to the bottom each month by 1917. Britain came dangerously close to starvation as food imports dwindled. The Allies developed countermeasures through painful experience and innovation. The convoy system, grouping merchant ships together under escort by destroyers and other warships, proved far more effective than allowing merchants to sail independently. A submarine that approached a convoy faced multiple potential opponents and risked destruction even if it managed to sink 1 or 2 ships. Depth charges, explosive devices that detonated at preset depths, gave surface ships weapons that could attack submerged submarines. Hydrophones, primitive underwater microphones, allowed trained operators to detect submarine engines and propellers, providing warning and approximate bearing even when the submarine was invisible. The combination of convoys, escort vessels, and anti-submarine weapons gradually turned the tide. U-boat losses mounted, while the tonnage they sank declined. Aircraft made their first significant impact on naval warfare during World War I, though their full potential would not be realised for another 2 decades. Float planes launched from cruisers scouted ahead of fleets, providing reconnaissance beyond the horizon. Flying boats patrolled coastal waters, searching for submarines and mines. Dirigibles and blimps provided air cover for convoys, their presence alone often sufficient to keep submarines submerged and unable to attack effectively. The British Royal Naval Air Service even attempted to attack German naval bases with torpedo-carrying aircraft, achieving limited success but demonstrating possibilities that would later transform naval combat. The idea of aircraft carriers, ships designed to launch and recover airplanes at sea, led to experimental conversions of merchant ships and cruisers. The interwar period between 1918 and 1939 saw continued naval development constrained by arms limitation treaties. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited the size and number of battleships that major powers could build, attempting to prevent another expensive arms race. The treaty established ratios for capital ship tonnage, with Britain and the United States allowed the largest fleets, Japan somewhat smaller, and France and Italy smaller still. These limitations encouraged innovation within the constraints. Since the number and size of battleships were restricted, navies invested in improving the effectiveness of existing ships and developing new technologies for cruisers, destroyers, and submarines that faced fewer restrictions. Naval aviation advanced rapidly during the interwar years. Aircraft carriers evolved from experimental conversions to purpose-built vessels designed from the keel up to operate aircraft. The carrier represented a fundamentally different approach to naval warfare, projecting power through aircraft rather than guns. A carrier could strike targets hundreds of miles away, far beyond the range of the most powerful battleship guns. The challenges were immense. Landing aircraft on a moving, pitching deck in all weather conditions, protecting the carrier itself from enemy attack, coordinating complex operations involving dozens of aircraft, and developing tactics for using this new weapon effectively. Radar, developed in the late 1930s, promised to revolutionize naval warfare by allowing detection of ships and aircraft far beyond visual range and in darkness or poor weather. Early naval radar systems were crude, with limited range and poor resolution, but even imperfect information was better than none. A ship equipped with radar could detect an approaching enemy in time to prepare for action or maneuver to advantageous position. Radar fire control, using radio waves to measure range precisely and track targets, dramatically improved gunnery accuracy. Submarine technology also advanced significantly. Diesel engines for surface running became more powerful and reliable, allowing greater speed and range. Electric motors for submerged operation improved, though battery capacity remained limited. Stronger pressure hulls allowed deeper diving, making submarines harder to attack with depth charges. Torpedo technology progressed with more reliable engines, better guidance systems, and more powerful warheads. Submarines grew larger, displacing 1,000 tons or more, with ranges that allowed them to operate across entire oceans. World War II fundamentally reshaped naval warfare, demonstrating that control of the air was prerequisite to control of the sea. The aircraft carrier, viewed by many as supplementary to the battleship at the war's beginning, emerged as the dominant capital ship. This transformation occurred through a series of actions that progressively revealed the carrier's capabilities and the battleship's vulnerability to air attack. The British attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940 provided an early demonstration. 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers, launched from the carrier Illustrious, struck the Italian battle fleet anchored in its heavily defended harbour. The slow, obsolescent biplanes navigated through darkness and anti-aircraft fire to hit 3 battleships, putting them out of action for months. The attack achieved with a handful of aircraft what a battleship fleet could not have accomplished without major losses. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 provided an even more devastating demonstration of carrier air power. 6 Japanese carriers launched more than 350 aircraft in 2 waves that caught the American Pacific Fleet unprepared. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, along with numerous other vessels and aircraft. The attack crippled American battleship strength in the Pacific, but crucially failed to catch the American carriers, which were at sea. This accident of timing proved decisive. The United States entered the war with its carrier force intact, while much of its battleship fleet lay on the harbour bottom. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked another milestone, the first naval battle in which the opposing fleets never came within sight of each other. American and Japanese carriers maneuvered for position, launching strikes while trying to avoid enemy attacks. Aircraft became the weapons, searching across hundreds of miles of ocean for enemy carriers, then diving through defensive fighters and anti-aircraft fire to deliver bombs and torpedoes. The battle was tactically indecisive, with both sides losing carriers, but it demonstrated that carrier warfare demanded new skills and tactics entirely different from traditional gunnery duels. 1 month later, at Midway, carrier aviation proved decisive in the Pacific War's most important naval battle. 4 Japanese carriers approached Midway Island as part of a complex operation intended to draw out and destroy the remaining American carrier force. American codebreakers had discovered the plan, allowing Admiral Nimitz to position his 3 carriers in ambush. The battle was chaotic, with American attacks initially failing to locate their targets or achieve hits. But a strike by dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers, with their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft preparing to launch. Bombs penetrated to the hangar decks where aviation fuel and ordnance created catastrophic fires. 3 carriers were burning wrecks within minutes. A 4th was sunk later in the day. The Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers and their highly trained air crews, losses from which it never recovered. Yet while carrier aviation proved dominant in the Pacific, the Atlantic War centered on the unglamorous but existential struggle between submarines and the merchant shipping that sustained Britain and supported Allied operations. German U-boats operating in wolf packs coordinated by radio devastated Allied convoys in the early war years. The tonnage sunk climbed alarmingly through 1941 and 1942, exceeding the rate at which new ships could be built. Allied defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic would have made victory in Europe impossible, strangling Britain and preventing the build-up of forces necessary for eventual invasion of the continent. The Allies gradually gained the upper hand through a combination of technological advances and tactical improvements. High-frequency direction finding allowed convoy escorts to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions, the very communications that made wolf-pack tactics possible. Improved radar could detect surfaced submarines at night, when they had previously operated with relative impunity. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers accompanying convoys, provided air cover in mid-ocean where land-based aircraft could not reach. Long-range patrol aircraft, equipped with radar and depth charges, hunted submarines across wide areas. Most importantly, Allied shipyards produced escort vessels and merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them, while U-boat losses mounted. By mid-1943, the battle had turned decisively. Surface warfare continued throughout the conflict, though increasingly in support of amphibious operations rather than in traditional fleet actions. Battleships, instead of dueling each other, provided shore bombardment for landing forces. Their heavy guns could deliver enormous volumes of high-explosive shells onto beaches and inland targets, supporting troops during the vulnerable early phases of amphibious assault. Naval gunfire support became a crucial element of amphibious warfare, the modern expression of the age-old military principle that control of the sea enabled power projection onto land. The Pacific War saw the refinement of amphibious assault to unprecedented levels of sophistication. Island-hopping campaigns across the Central Pacific required landing troops on defended beaches thousands of miles from major bases. Each operation involved complex coordination, minesweepers clearing approaches, bombardment ships softening defences, airstrikes suppressing enemy positions, landing craft delivering troops and equipment, and support vessels sustaining the force ashore. The invasions of Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa each taught brutal lessons about the challenges of opposed landings against determined defenders. Kamikaze attacks, Japanese suicide aircraft deliberately crashing into ships, introduced a new dimension of horror to naval warfare in the war's final year. Conventional air attacks could be defeated by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Damaged aircraft turned away or crashed short. Kamikaze pilots committed to dying pressed attacks through defensive fire, requiring destruction of the aircraft before it reached its target. Even damaged planes could strike ships, and a determined pilot could guide a crippled aircraft into a collision that killed him, but also devastated his target. The kamikazes sank dozens of ships and damaged hundreds more, but they could not stop the inexorable Allied advance toward Japan. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. That invasion would have been the largest amphibious operation in history, dwarfing the Normandy landings. The atomic bombs, delivered by land-based aircraft, made the invasion unnecessary. Yet they also demonstrated that a single weapon could now destroy an entire city, a destructive power that would profoundly influence post-war naval development. The post-war world witnessed naval development shaped by two overriding realities: the existence of nuclear weapons and the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The aircraft carrier, proven dominant during World War II, evolved into a platform for projecting power globally. American supercarriers, displacing 80,000 tons or more, operated jets capable of delivering nuclear weapons against targets hundreds of miles inland. These floating air bases represented mobile, survivable striking power that could be positioned anywhere the world's oceans reached. A carrier battle group, comprising the carrier itself and its escorting cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, constituted a formidable force capable of controlling vast areas of sea and projecting power ashore. The nuclear submarine emerged as perhaps the most revolutionary naval development of the post-war era. USS Nautilus, launched in 1954, was the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Her reactor provided essentially unlimited underwater endurance, constrained only by crew supplies and maintenance needs rather than battery capacity or fuel. Nuclear submarines could remain submerged for months, travelling at speeds exceeding 30 knots while deep beneath the surface. This capability transformed submarine warfare. No longer restricted to brief underwater sprints between surface transits, nuclear submarines could patrol entire oceans submerged, hunt enemy shipping or submarines without surfacing, and approach hostile coasts undetected. The development of submarine-launched ballistic missiles created a new category of warship, the nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. These vessels carried missiles with nuclear warheads, each missile capable of striking targets thousands of miles away. A single submarine might carry 16 or more missiles, each with multiple warheads, representing destructive power exceeding all the bombs dropped in World War II. These submarines operated on extended patrols in deep ocean areas, remaining hidden while maintaining readiness to launch their missiles if ordered. The strategic logic was deterrence. An enemy contemplating nuclear attack knew that submarines at sea would survive any first strike and could retaliate devastatingly. Anti-submarine warfare evolved into a complex, multi-dimensional discipline requiring sophisticated technology and tactics. Nuclear submarines were difficult targets, quiet and capable of operating at depths where pressure crushed conventional weapons. Detection required passive sonar systems that could hear the subtle sounds of submarine machinery and propellers at ranges of dozens of miles, or active sonar that sent out pulses of sound and listened for echoes. surface ships deployed towed sonar arrays, long cables with hydrophones that trailed behind the vessel, listening for submarines while isolated from the noise of the ship's own machinery. Maritime patrol aircraft dropped sonar buoys, disposable sonar devices that radioed detections back to the aircraft. The introduction of guided missiles revolutionized surface warfare as profoundly as the torpedo had a century earlier. Anti-ship missiles, skimming low over the water at near-sonic speeds, could strike targets from beyond visual range, penetrating defenses before crews even saw the incoming weapon. The Soviet Navy developed large arsenals of anti-ship missiles, compensating for their smaller carrier force by threatening American carriers with massed missile attacks. Defense against these weapons required layered systems: early warning radar to detect launches, electronic warfare to jam missile guidance, surface-to-air missiles to intercept incoming weapons, and close-in weapon systems as last-ditch defense. The Falklands War of 1982 provided sobering demonstrations of modern naval warfare's lethality. Argentine aircraft armed with bombs and Exocet anti-ship missiles attacked the British task force sent to retake the Falkland Islands. The destroyer HMS Sheffield was struck by a single Exocet missile that set fires the crew could not control, eventually forcing the ship's abandonment. Argentine aircraft pressing low-level attacks with conventional bombs sank or damaged several other British ships. The lessons were stark. Modern weapons could destroy modern ships quickly, even when those ships possessed sophisticated defenses. Aegis combat systems, developed by the United States Navy and deployed beginning in the 1980s, represented an attempt to manage the information overload and rapid response times of modern naval combat. The Aegis system integrated powerful radar, computers, and missile launchers into a coordinated whole capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and engaging multiple threats in rapid succession. The phased array radar, consisting of thousands of individual elements that could be electronically steered without moving the antenna, could shift instantly from scanning for distant threats to tracking incoming missiles. Aegis-equipped cruisers and destroyers became the foundation of carrier battle group air defense. Stealth technology, developed initially for aircraft, began influencing warship design by the late 20th century. Radar cross-section reduction through careful shaping of hulls and superstructures made ships harder to detect and track at long range. Angled surfaces reflected radar energy away from the transmitter rather than back toward it. Radar-absorbent materials coating critical areas further reduced detectability. These measures could not make ships invisible, but reducing detection range by even a few miles could provide crucial tactical advantages. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s did not diminish the importance of naval power, but shifted its primary applications. Rather than preparing for high-intensity conflict between superpower fleets, navies increasingly focused on power projection, crisis response, and operations in littoral zones, the shallow waters near coasts where most of the world's population lived. Aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships provided mobile bases for operations ranging from humanitarian relief to limited military interventions. Cruise missiles, launched from surface ships and submarines, allowed precise strikes against land targets without putting aircraft and pilots at risk. Modern warships are platforms for integrating multiple systems into coherent fighting capabilities. A contemporary destroyer displaces 9,000 tons or more and carries an array of weapons and sensors that would have seemed fantastic even 30 years earlier. Vertical launch systems provide flexibility to carry different weapon types and launch them rapidly. Multifunction radar systems track air, surface, and even ballistic missile threats simultaneously. Helicopters operating from flight decks extend the ship's reach. Data links connect ships to each other and to aircraft and satellites, creating networks where information from multiple sensors can be fused into comprehensive tactical pictures. Emerging technologies promise to transform naval warfare once again. Unmanned surface and underwater vehicles extend surveillance and strike capabilities without risking human lives. Directed energy weapons, lasers and electromagnetic railguns may supplement or replace missiles and guns. Hypersonic missiles, travelling at 5 times the speed of sound or faster, challenge existing defensive systems. These developments continue a pattern as old as naval warfare itself, new technologies creating new threats and requiring new defences, an endless competition between offence and defence. The warship has evolved from wooden galleys to nuclear-powered carriers, from bronze rams to guided missiles, yet it remains what it has always been, a platform for projecting power across water, shaped by the eternal interplay of human ingenuity, strategic necessity, and the unforgiving physics of combat at sea.